So, very warm welcome, everyone. This is our first meeting in 2023 of our project seminar series. Our speaker today is Professor Gabriele Gava from the University of Turin. So, welcome, Gabriele. And he'll be touching a topic of interest for our project that regards the regulative use of the ideas of reason in Kant's philosophy. So that's extremely important for us. And I leave it now to you, Gabriele, for the presentation. Thank you very much.
So thanks, Silvia, for the kind invitation and people of the Proteus group for being here. So I'm really glad to present this paper in this context, and I look forward to receive your feedback. So I have a presentation which I shall share with you. So let's see. Okay, you can see it well, right? Can you confirm? Okay, great. So the title of the paper, as you see, is Kant on the status of ideas and principle of reason. So so it's clear the paper will be about so the concept of ideas and principle of reason in Kant, and so the first thing that I want to do is to clarify what I will not be talking about today. And so I think one of the topics that has been discussed much when we take into consideration ideas of reason and principle of reason in Kant is what it means that we can use these ideas or this principle either constitutively or regulatively, because it is well known that Kant says that ideas like the idea of God or the idea of the soul cannot constitute real or valid cognition, but still they can have a positive role as when our reason uses them in a regulative way. And so this is a distinction that you find in many discussions regarding the ideas. And so one key issue here is to understand what it means, for example, to use one idea constitutively or to use it regulatively, because that's not clear at all. And so if we take the regulative side of this couple of concepts, so we might ask what it means to assume an idea regulatively, and there have been different proposals on this topic. So we might say, for example, that assuming something regulatively means having an attitude where what we take regulatively as the value of a certain hypothesis that guides our research into nature, or some other have associated the regulative use of ideas to what Kant calls belief. So one question here is, what kind of attitude do we have when we assume something regulatively? But this is not what I'm interested about today. So I'm not interested in figuring out what it means to assume something either constitutively or regulatively. I'm more interested in determining what is it that we can take either constitutively or regulatively. So in this sense, I will try to figure out how we should characterize ideas and principle of reasons themselves. And I try to spell out this problem by saying that so my concern here has to do with the status of these ideas and principles. So so this maybe is not yet clear enough. So let me try to say a bit more about it. So and I mean, to clarify and to get the sense in which I use the word status, it is useful to say that in talking of status here, I would like to point toward a question that concerns proposition that these ideas and principles imply. Okay, so that ideas of reason and principle of reason imply. Okay, but here, so maybe this is not helpful enough, because one might ask at this point, in which sense do ideas or principle of reason imply proposition, right? So that could be maybe somehow clear if we focus on principle of reason, because I mean it is more immediate to think that principle can be put in propositional forms, but ideas in Kant are concepts. So in which sense do ideas imply proposition? So let me try to spell out how the ideas can imply proposition, and one sense in which they can imply proposition is when we use proposition to express essential marks of a concept, of ideas as concepts. So marks can be considered a conceptual component of concept in general. So every concept is constituted by marks, or we might say sub-concept in Kant. And so when we spell out these conceptual components of concept and of ideas in particular, then we can express this in proposition. So from the concept of God, we can then express its component by saying God is omniscient, God is omnipotent. And in this way, then, starting from our concept or idea of God, we obtain a proposition that can be directly derived from that concept. This is a sense in which ideas imply proposition. But there is another sense, I think, that is relevant. And so when we assert the existence of the object described by one idea, we can also obtain a proposition which simply express the existence of that object. So, and we can, so using again the concept of God, we can then derive the proposition God exists. And in this case, we have a proposition that is not probably directly derived from a concept, but still we have a proposition that is related to a concept when we use that concept as something describing an actual object, an existing object. Okay, so this is the sense in which I say ideas can imply proposition. So let's go back to what it means to trying to determine what is the status of idea. Well, to see that, I think it is useful to distinguish among three interpretations of the status of ideas and principles that have already been proposed. And so I think through this possible interpretation of the status of ideas, I mean, you get a more immediate sense of what I mean by status in this context. And so in these views are the following. So one view says that these propositions that we can derive or that are implied in ideas and principle of reason are propositions that we know are false, but can be assumed for their heuristic value. Okay, so in this sense, ideas are formed or imply propositions that we know are false, but still there is a sense in which it is for us rational to use them as guiding principle for their heuristic value. Then in a second interpretation, so the propositions that are implied by ideas are propositions that we know are true, but are indeterminate. So this means that these propositions are vague, and so we so they need to be specified and determined through empirical research, but still we know, and we know a priori that they apply. And so in this sense, this proposition express valid cognition of nature. So in the third possible interpretation says that proposition implied by ideas are propositions that we do not know whether they are true or false, but can be true. Okay, so and that's for sure. So as far as we know, we do not know whether these propositions are true or false, and of course they can be true in this sense. So if you look at the literature and the way in which these views are defended, so I think the basic assumption is that just one of these alternatives should be true. So just one of these can be true, and the other false. And so when one argues for one of these options, so the idea is that he or she is also rejecting the other two. And so the main idea in my paper is to challenge this assumption. And in particular, I would suggest that two of these options are true to Kant's ideas. So the first one and the third one that you see in the slide. And this is possible just because Kant does not have a uniform account of ideas according to which all ideas, all principles of reason have the same status, as I've tried to define this word. So my strategy will be to show then that the first and the third interpretation are actually compatible, just because not all ideas for Kant have the same status. And as far as the second interpretation is concerned, I will provide some reasons to put that aside. Okay, so that's the view. So, of course, you might ask at this point, what has all this to do with cosmology? So you have a project on time and cosmology. And so this is a talk within a series on this topic. So what has this to do with it? Well, I mean, to provide a quick answer is, I mean, I can say that one type of idea that we will be discussing are cosmological ideas in Kant. And this is, of course, the easy way to draw the connection. But I think so that there is also a stronger link in the sense that cosmological ideas will be not only one type of ideas that we will be discussing, but it is the type of ideas where we really see that there is something specific in one kind of ideas for Kant that compels us to treat them on a separate level. Okay, so that's the connection. I hope that's enough. Okay, so let's see what the structure of the talk will be. So I will start by presenting 3 readings of the status of ideas in principle, and these will be the 3 reading to which I've already hinted, and then I will move to presenting so a differentiation that Markus Vilacek has recently defended between 2 distinctions in Kant, so the one between regulative and constitutive on the one hand, and the one between logical and transcendental on the other, just because I think this differentiation helps us to see that the second reading that I've already hinted at is not so compelling once we have made the adequate distinction. And then, so finally, I will try to show that the 2 remaining readings of the status of ideas are compatible, as I was suggesting, and I think this can be seen if we take into consideration some passages in the so where Kant speaks of the polemical use of reason in the discipline of reason of the first critique, so in the doctrine, in the transcendental doctrine of method of the first critique. Okay, so that's the structure. So if you have question or there is something that is not clear even while I'm talking, so don't worry, and stop me, and I can try to make it clear immediately. But yeah, just to say it. So let's move forward, and I now then move to the 3 reading of the status of ideas that I've already sketched in my introduction. And as I said, the first reading claims that ideas and principles that can be assumed regulatively, and we might say even constitutively, even if that assumption would not be a legitimate assumption. So the ideas and principle of reason in this sense imply propositions that we know are false. So there are various people that I think defend a view of this kind and an interpretation of this kind of ideas and principle of reason. I here focus on Michel Grier's interpretation, just because it has been an influential reading of the dialectic, and so it is helpful to use it as a reference point here. So how can we summarize Grier's interpretation? Well, in brief, she claims that there are 2 principles of reason. So the first principle she calls P1, and she said that this is a logical principle that prescribes unity to condition cognition by pushing us to seek for the unconditioned from which they can be derived. So P1 is a principle that has to do with cognition, not objects, and then so the what it does is simply to prescribe us to look for more general cognition from which given cognition can be derived, where this process should be iterated until we find the unconditioned condition from which all this cognition can be derived, right? So what is the second principle of reason? So this is called P2, and she says this is an illusory principle in which we take P1 as valid and applying to objects themselves. So the difference between P1 and P2 is that in P2, we take that this relationship between condition and unconditioned is something that apply to object themselves. And so there should be then an unconditioned in the object themselves. So, and according to Greer, we assume the idea of an unconditioned objectively given as a guide for our inquiry, even though we recognize that assumption is false and illusory. So the point here is that when we do assume P2 regulatively, so there is a legitimate use of P2, so of the principle that that says that there is an unconditioned as a description of objects, but the only way to use that principle in a legitimate way is to recognize that that assumption is, so that principle is a false description of the object. Okay, so is illusory in this sense. So I think a reading can be classified in the first type. So where do we find evidence for this account of ideas in Kant? Well, I think the best place where to look is the antinomy of pure reason, where Kant says that so you find a quote here where Kant says that the idea of a totality of condition for a given condition can be legitimately assumed only as aufgegeben is the German word, but which is here translated as giving as a problem. But the idea is that the supreme principle of reason as a principle that say, given a condition, there must also be the totality of its conditions. So this principle is not a valid principle for Kant when it is applied to appearances, so to object as far as they are object of our experience. But still, even if this is the case, and we know after the solution of the antinomies that the principle is not valid, still assuming that there is a totality of condition in this sense can help us in our proceeding from the condition to its condition and another condition and so on. So it helps us just moving from identifying one condition after another condition, even though we know that there is no stop at this process. I mean, not definite and not determinate stop. And so simply we know that proceeding in this regress of condition, we are improving our cognition, and that the assumption of a totality of condition in this sense can help us, but the assumption would be invalid in a certain sense. Okay. So then there is a second possible reading of ideas and principle of reason, where ideas and principle that can be assumed regulatively or constitutively imply propositions that we know are true. And this view is defended, for example, by Thomas Wartenberg and more recently by Jim O'Shea. So their interpretations are different, but I think one common idea in them is that we should so they start their interpretation from the appendix to the dialectic, where Kant says that ideas of reason have objective but indeterminate validity. And he says that also when he speaks of the principle of specification, homogeneity, and continuity in nature. And they take these characterization of ideas and principle as the view that so we know that nature is homogeneous, continuous, and specified in its form, but we do not know to which degree it has this characteristic. Or to put it in a more immediate way, we know that nature is systematic, but we do not know to which degree it is systematic. And so some support for this reading can be found, well, of course, where Kant speaks of the objective but indeterminate validity of ideas. But another point on which they insist are those passages in which Kant, in describing the principle of homogeneity, continuity, and specification of nature, says that these principles are, first of all, logical maxims. So are maxims that guide us in telling us which kind of order, let's say, or which kind of cognition we should look for in our empirical cognition of nature. But then Kant also says that it would be irrational to assume these logical maxims if we do not at the same time use them or associate them to some transcendental principle, where this principle basically say that these characteristics that we should look for are characteristic of nature itself. Okay, and they take this passage, let's say, from a logical use to a transcendental use as evidence that this principle involves some valid cognition of nature. So this is the second reading. Let's see what the third reading is. So the third reading says that ideas and principles that can be assumed regulatively imply proposition that, as far as we know, can be true or false. So where does this reading find some plausibility? Well, I think a simple way to show that the assumption seems right is simply to build on Kant's transcendental idealism and on the distinction between appearances and thinking themselves. And if it is true that ideas, in particular, describe objects that cannot be given in possible experience, and if it is true then that the limits of our cognition are the limits of possible experience, so it seems plausible to say that ideas are concepts that characterize objects that are beyond those limits, are, I mean, imply proposition regarding which we should remain agnostic. And this is a way to support this reading. So more recently, Markus Wilaszek has provided an interpretation of the regulative use of ideas that goes in this direction, but insisting on another factor. So I mentioned this reading as an example of this view. So Wilaszek, in his reading, insists on the fact that using ideas regulatively involve an hypothetical use of reason. So in the appendix to the Transcendental Dialectic, Kant connects the regulative use of reason to an hypothetical use of reason. And so Wilaszek reads it, reads this claim as evidence that assuming ideas regulatively means, in a certain sense, using them as hypotheses. But if ideas can be used as hypotheses that guide our investigation of nature, it seems that they involve possibly true proposition. Because, I mean, it would be odd to use as an hypothesis ideas involving proposition that we know are false. So it seems, so the fact that we can call these ideas hypotheses, and I'm not defending that that's correct, so I'm just presenting a possible interpretation. So if this were the case, so it would be odd then to say ideas involves proposition that we know are false. So, and where do we find some evidence for this reading? Well, in those passages where Kant speaks about the hypothetical use of reason in the appendix to the Transcendental Dialectic. And I mean, in these passages, so the idea that is suggested, at least sometimes, is the view that so ideas can be used as a hypothesis that cannot be, or we do not know if they can be totally confirmed, but still our research into nature can somehow approximate a possible confirmation. So in this sense, they are hypotheses that guide our inquiry that can be in part confirmed, at least possibly, but still not totally. So they function just as something we can direct our research to, but that cannot really arrive at a full confirmation of those hypotheses. And Wilaszek insists on these passages where when he claims then that ideas can be considered in a certain sense hypotheses. Okay, good. But this is just one way to support the third possible reading. I think it is possible to support that possible reading even without insisting on ideas as hypotheses. Okay, good. So now we have the three possible reading of the status of ideas. So we have some more details on the three possible reading, and we can make sense of those. And these will be just the fundamental material of my talk. And now then the question is figuring out how to choose between this possible interpretation and also how to see the relationship between them. And so the first thing that I want to do is to to show that the second possible reading that I've just presented is not so plausible and compelling once we have introduced some further distinction that are relevant when we consider Kant's discussion of ideas and principle of reason in the appendix to the Transcendental Dialectic. And in this context, I will use Marcus Vilacek interpretation, and in particular, Marcus Vilacek interpretation of the differentiation, as I said, between the logical and transcendental distinction on the one side, and regulative constitutive distinction on the other side. Because when we then clearly differentiate between these two distinctions, I think it is possible to see that plausibly at the basis of those reading that claim that ideas and principle of reason imply propositions that we know are true, so there is a conflation between the concept of the transcendental and the concept of the constitutive. And I think this can be already appreciated if we so go back for a second to what I've said in presenting that reading in the previous section of the paper, and we saw that that reading gained some plausibility because Kant says that so principle of reason, like the principle of homogeneity, specification and continuity, should not be used only as logical principle, but as transcendental principle. And they take, so this use of the transcendental to imply that the principle involves some valid cognition of nature. But this seems to rest on at least implicit conflation of transcendental and constitutive, because so the fact that we have a transcendental principle is taken to imply that we have valid cognition of nature through those principles, and this seems in a sense to use those principles in a constitutive way. So I think when we separate the transcendental and the constitutive, we can avoid that conclusion. So that conclusion would not be so compelling anymore. So let's see then how Vilacek distinguished between this concept, just to see how we can avoid to make that conclusion. So Vilacek, in his recent book on the Transcendental Dialectic, argues that we should not equate the constitutive and the transcendental. Rather, a transcendental principle can be used either constitutively or regulatively. So the distinction between the constitutive and the regulative, it's a distinction that it is internal, let's say, it is subordinate to the concept of the transcendental. So, and how should we characterize a logical principle in Vilacek's view? Well, a logical principle is a prescriptive rule that tells us how to proceed in our inquiry. So it tells us what kind of cognition we should look for, what kind of order among our cognition, and so on. On the other hand, a transcendental principle is a principle which refers to object and not only to concept or cognition. But this, so here the reference to object should not be taken as the view that these, so the principle contain cognition of those objects. Simply, it is the content of the principle itself that, as its part, contains some description of objects. But that does not mean that there is any object corresponding to that principle or not. Okay, so the fact that the principle is transcendental in this sense simply describe the principle as characterize the principle as somehow having to do with object or having object as its content. And then, so we can take the principle either regulatively if we do not take that principle as implying cognition of the object that figure somehow as its referent or content, so regulatively, so not as containing cognition, or constitutively as containing cognition, as implying cognition. So reading transcendental in this way, the fact that Kant calls this principle transcendental, so homogeneity, specification, and continuity, cannot be used as evidence that they involve knowledge or cognition of object. And so if we then follow this this way of arguing, so the second reading of the status of ideas loses some of its force, and it doesn't seem so compelling anymore. Okay, good. All right. So I now move to the last part of my talk, and so now we have just two possible ways of reading the status of ideas that are still in the picture. Sorry. Yeah, sorry for that. So I was saying now we have two possible readings still on the plate, and we need to understand what we should do with them. And as I already suggested, my claim is that actually these two readings are compatible. So the reading that submits that ideas and principle imply proposition that we know are false, and the reading that submits that ideas and principle or reason imply proposition that, as far as we know, can be either true or false, are both correct accounts of the status of ideas and principles. So sorry for the typos in the slides. Sorry for that. How is it possible to sustain this view? Well, this is possible because not all ideas and principles of reason have the same status. And I already suggested as I already suggested in the introduction, I think this can be seen, and so we find some evidence for this view if we consider Kant's analysis of the polemical use of reason in the discipline of pure reason of the first critique. So what is the polemical use of reason? So before we see the relevant passages, let me say a couple of words on the context here. So Kant described the polemical use of reason as the defense of its proposition against dogmatic denials of them. So what are its proposition here? Well, basically here Kant is claiming that reason has at least some interest in affirming, or a tendency to affirm, certain proposition, where, for example, we can affirm that God exists, or the soul is immortal, and so on. And then, but since so these kind of proposition are also propositions that give rise to infinite conflicts among philosophers, there are also people denying then this proposition, that denying that God exists, for example. And so here the polemical use of reason would be just a reaction to these denials of reason proposition that affirm the contrary, but still on dogmatic grounds. Okay, so we would have people claiming that God exists, people denied that God exists, people then providing counter arguments to the denials and so on, but all on dogmatic grounds. So this is the polemical use of reason. So especially, I mean, describing those that would defend the proposition. So the polemical use of reason points toward that use of reason. So that the defense of its proposition in this sense. So, and in speaking of the polemical use of reason, Kant also speak of a polemic of reason. What is a polemic of reason? Well, it's basically the conflict between proposition where the polemical use of reason has also a role. So the polemic use of reason, in the polemic of use of reason, we find a conflict between proposition concerning object of pure reason, where some would defend the idea that God exists, or a certain view about the world as a whole, a certain view about the soul, and there would, or people would deny that the soul exists, and so on. So why is the discussion of the polemic use of reason interesting for our purposes? It is interesting because Kant, in this context, argues that there are two ways of reacting to the polemic, which correspond to two forms the polemic takes. So Kant suggests that the polemic of reason, so the way in which this conflict between different propositions comes to be, takes two very different forms. And so my suggestion is that in turn, these two forms of the polemic correspond to two different types of ideas. And if we then see, if we make this connection, it is then possible to see that the two alternative readings that are still on the table are actually both accurate description of what ideas are for Kant, but simply they are looking to different ideas. Okay, so let's see the passages where Kant distinguishes between these two types of the polemic, or these two forms of the polemic. And the first passage describes the polemic that we have in the antinomies. So I quote, "We had such an apparent antithetic of reason before us above, to be sure, but it turned out that it rested on a misunderstanding, namely that of taking, in accord with common prejudice, appearances for things in themselves, and then demanding an absolute completeness in their synthesis. There was thus, in that case, no real contradiction of reason with itself in the proposition, the series of appearances given in themselves as an absolutely first beginning, and this series is absolutely and in itself without any beginning. For both propositions are quite compatible, since appearances are, as regards their existence as appearances in themselves, are nothing at all. That is, something contradictory, and thus their presupposition must naturally be followed by contradictory consequences." End of the quote. So for me, what is important in this quote is that Kant clearly states that the conflict in this case is only apparent. So and there is no real contradiction of reason in this case. And I'll try to make sense of it in a second. And then he goes on, Kant goes on and says that something different happens when we take into consideration other ideas, and in particular, so theological and psychological ideas. So I quote, however, such a misunderstanding cannot be alleged, and the conflict of reason thereby set aside if, say, it is asserted theistically there is a highest being, and asserted atheistically, on the contrary, there is no highest being. Or when it is asserted in psychology, everything that thinks is of absolutely persistent unity, and therefore distinct from all transitory material unity, against which someone else asserts the soul is not an immaterial unity and cannot be exempted from all transitoriness. For the object of the question is here free of anything foreign that contradicts its nature, and the understanding is concerned only with things in himself and not with appearances. So there does certainly be a genuine conflict here, if only pure reason and anything to say on the negative side that would approximate the ground for an assertion. So again, what is important for me here is that in this case, so when we say on the one hand, God exists, God does not exist, or the soul is immortal, the soul is not immortal, and so on. So here there is a real conflict. So these and this makes the polemic here completely different, and also the way to react to the polemic is completely different, because here we cannot say there is no real polemic at all, but so the reaction, the correct reaction for this form of the polemic is to say, well, this could be a real conflict, but this object lies beyond the limit of our possible cognition, so we have no grounds to assert either so one side of the conflict or the other. So in this sense, we should make a step back. But these are two really different ways of reacting to the polemic, and also to analyze and to make sense of the polemic we start with. So how should we read these claims? Well, as I was saying, the polemic in the antinomies is only apparent since the propositions that form it are both false, because they both assume that there must be a totality of condition for a given condition appearances. Okay, and that assumption is incorrect and invalid for Kant when we start from a given appearance, a given condition that is an appearance. And I think this is true for all antinomies, not just for the mathematical antinomies. But I'll say something more on the antinomies in a second. On the other hand, the polemic in the case of the ideas of God and the soul can be real because the proposition forming it can be true. But this suggests that propositions involved by the cosmological ideas are false, while propositions involved by theological and psychological ideas can be true. And this is a way then to support then this distinction between two types of ideas to which I want to arrive. Okay, but so I think we need to make some additional distinction when we deal with cosmological ideas in particular. Because I think what we have said until now is still a bit too vague and a bit too general. So I think what we can say on cosmological ideas in general is what follows. So we can say for all cosmological ideas that cosmological ideas imply, sorry for the typos again, false proposition because they rest on the supreme principle of reason, which is false when applied to appearances. So for all kind of cosmological ideas and for all the antinomies that are connected to these ideas, we can say that it's wrong to assume that when a given condition appearance is given, then the totality of its condition must also be given. And this is then invalid for all cosmological ideas and for all the kinds of antinomies. But while for the mathematical antinomies, a totality of condition for a given condition appearance is impossible, this totality can be given for the dynamical antinomies. Okay. Yeah, sorry if I do not go into details of the antinomies. But if what I mean is not clear, then we can go into details in the discussion. So I'll try to make some sense of what I'm saying, so to make the idea more clear by focusing now for a moment on the first antinomy and the third antinomy, just as example of the mathematical antinomies on the one hand and the dynamical antinomies on the other. So if we take the first antinomy in its time version, so you know there are two versions of the first antinomy, one regarding time, one regarding space, and we might take, the view at the basis of the first antinomy as the view that there must be a totality of elapsed time moments which are the condition of the present time moment, right? Then so this assumption can take two forms, either this totality is finite or infinite. But if we look at the solution of the first antinomy, so this rests on the view that I cannot really think this totality as possible, for I can only think of a continuous progression from condition to its condition and so on. So I cannot think when I think of the totality of condition in time for a given moment in time, I cannot think that there is a given determined totality of time that is the condition for the existence of this moment. And this is, connected to the solution of the first antinomy, where Kant says famously that the alternative between finite and infinite in this sense is not a real contradictory alternative, but there is a third possibility where the regress from condition to condition is indefinite, right? So, so in this case, it is wrong to assume that there can be a totality of condition of a given condition. So in this sense, assuming that there is such a totality involves assuming a proposition that is false. If we take the third antinomy as an example of the dynamical antinomies, so we can say that the assumption that lies at the basis of both the thesis and the antithesis is that there must be a totality of causes that are the condition of a given event or change. And even here, we can have either an infinite series of causes or a finite series of causes. But in this case, so and this is a difference with respect to the first antinomy, it is possible that a totality is given. And this is possible if a free cause that would stop the regress in the series of causes would be given. And so here, this possibility is granted by the fact that I can think an unconditioned condition that closes the series, which is not an appearance. So in this case, the proposition there is a totality of causes that are the condition of a given event, change, is possibly true. But still, as I was suggesting, even for the third antinomy, it is still true that the supreme principle of reason that says, given a condition appearance, there must be a totality of condition for that conditioned. So that principle is false, even for the third antinomy. But this is compatible to saying that there can be a totality of condition. So it is possible, but it is not necessary in this case. Okay, so let's conclude. And I think this can be used as, so I made this further distinction among the cosmological ideas just because I wanted to gain some more clarity to identify which are the ideas of one type and which are the ideas of another type. And now I think we can conclude and then distinguish these two types, distinguish between these two types of ideas. So on the one hand, we have ideas of the first type, which are ideas that imply propositions that we know are false. And here the main case is the cosmological ideas that give rise to the mathematical antinomies. And then these ideas are characterized by the fact that they assume that there is a given totality of condition for a given appearance, where this totality of condition is a totality where every member of the series of condition is itself an appearance. Okay, and this is fundamental to figuring out why these ideas are, implied proposition that we know are false. And then we have ideas of the second type, where these are ideas that imply propositions that can be true or false, as far as we know. And here, the example that we have seen are proposition regarding God and the soul. But then we've also, under this category, cosmological ideas that assume that there is a given totality of condition for a given conditionate appearance, where, however, there can be members of the totality that are not appearances. And these, so for example, here we have the third antinomy, so the antinomy concerning freedom, or also the fourth antinomy, so the antinomy concerning a necessary condition of the world. And here, of course, is interesting to ask, but it's not something that I've done in this paper, to consider the relationship between these cases that fall under these kind of ideas. And so it is interesting to consider whether the idea of God and the soul are ideas where we think a totality of condition for a given condition appearance, where so members of that totality are not appearances, or whether in this object the idea of a totality of condition is not so important at the end. But this is matter for another paper. So I stop here, and I thank you for your attention.
Okay. Thank you very much, Gabriele, for your talk. We can clap our hands, actually. So I'm now asking people whether they want to jump in and ask questions to our speaker. Yeah, Laura Follesa.
Thank you, Silvia. Thank you for the talk. Hi.
Hi.
Oh, sorry for I'm not using the cam now, so sorry for that. So maybe I have just kind of terminological questions, so clarification question. Because I haven't, it's not clear to me the reason why you so you rejected the second reading, and in particular the problem is with the notion of indetermination, and in connection with the use of the term approximation also for the proposition in the third reading. So what kind of distinction we have between a proposition which is not which is indeterminate, and the proposition which has an approximation to truth. So I don't know if, so we can start from this, and then maybe I can add more questions this kind. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. So this is a very good question. And so let's start with the indeterminacy side of the question. So here, basically, the idea in the second reading is, I mean, the indeterminacy of the validity. So this is a characterization of the validity of ideas in the appendix, is something that Kant insists on in a couple of passages. So Kant says, so these ideas or this principle have objective but indeterminate validity. And so people saying that so these principle or ideas involve cognition of nature, then they just so they use indeterminacy just to say, well, these are real cognition, right? So I know that nature is systematic. So it's something that can be justified a priori, and I already know that nature is systematic, but I do not know to which degree it is systematic. So for example, I know that there is a system of empirical laws in nature, because this is O'Shea's version of this reading, just because this is already implied in the second analogy, but I do not know which particular system of empirical laws is actual in the world. And so the systematicity then can come in different degrees. So maybe it is true that all laws can be brought under a very small number of principles. Maybe it's not true, but still there are some kind of systematic interconnection among these principles and so on. But I can anticipate a priori that there is a system of nature. So this is, in this sense, ideas are objective, but indeterminate. And I insist on the indeterminacy of the validity of ideas to to stress that their reading is compatible with Kant's claims that that ideas should be used regulatively, right? Because so this mark a difference with, for example, our categories. So the categories are cognition of nature that provide us with a determinate, in a sense, characterization of what nature should be for us to be cognizable by us. And so ideas, on the other hand, are regulative because so they remain vague in a sense, and so it is our task then to determine these ideas in our empirical research, right? I hope this is clear now.
Yes, thanks.
And why should this reading be rejected? I mean, I don't think it must be rejected, but in order to claim that ideas imply actual cognition of nature, you really need to have a strong argument to defend the view. And I think the plausibility for this line of interpretation can be gathered from the claim that this principle have transcendent, or I mean, from the claim that they have objective but indeterminate validity, or from the claim that they have transcendental validity. And the view here is that if we can provide a reading of the the concept transcendental in this concept that is plausible and does not involve the claim that ideas are cognition, I think this reading should be preferred just because it is more coherent with what Kant says in general on ideas. And so it is coherent with the fact that Kant says that ideas cannot be used as cognition. Okay?
Okay. Yes, perfect. Yeah, thanks.
And,
yeah,
and regarding the approximation part, so I think that so in order to maybe make clearer the distinction between the second reading and the third reading in the version I presented by Vilacek. So I think the approximation idea is present also in the second reading, okay, in a certain
degree. Yeah.
No, maybe
you also use the term degree, so in this sense I associated the term.
Yeah, that's a good question. But so there is so in the second reading, the idea is that we have an idea of the systematicity of nature, right? So this is the relevant idea here, and we know that nature is systematic. So and we progress in making that idea more determinate. So I think that maybe you can to see some role for the idea of approximation in that reading. You can say that with the very vague idea we start with, it comes also an idea of the task we have, that is, we should determine that idea, right? And so so the task would be, to approximate as far as possible a perfect determination of that idea. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's a way of seeing some role for the approximation idea in that reading.
So maybe in the sense that you don't have the possibility of false propositions, so it must be somehow.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I mean the idea is that the true proposition in this version is just nature is systematic, nature is homogeneous, nature is continuous, nature is specified in its form. So these are the propositions that we know are true according to this reading, but simply we do not know to which degree, to what degree they are true, right? In Vilacek's reading, so the idea is that so for example, you can take the psychological idea of the soul as a substance, as a basic hypothesis that gives you the possibility to make some secondary hypothesis, right? So I have the guiding hypothesis that is in the background that there is a soul that is substantial, and if that this is true, it might be possible then to unite some faculty that belong to that substantial soul, right? So, and this is a second order, let's say, hypothesis. And then if I can confirm this second hypothesis, so somehow, so this can work as a partial confirmation that the idea from which I started is true, but we can never arrive to confirming that the hypothesis, the soul is substantial, is true. And so, and the difference here is that so when we start with this hypothesis, the possibility that it is either true or false are both on the table. Mm-hmm. Yep. And I would say they remain on the table even when we test the hypothesis we generate through this first hypothesis. And so this is different from the second reading where I mean, these vague propositions are, I mean, said to be true from the very beginning.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, clear. Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much.
So I see Rodrigo. Do you want to ask a question?
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Gabriele, for the talk. And I think you already know more or less what I'm going to ask, because I already told you in person. And actually, the more I think about it, about this question, the more it becomes complicated even to formulate, because it has so many implications. And so I don't even know if it's correct the way I put it. But it would be interesting to have a discussion on it. So I will try. But if I got it right, the basic point is that, like, to better understand what you mean by implying, like something that is implied in the idea, that in order to, following Vilacek, in order to follow, to use regulatively the transcendental principle, you need to assume as true some propositions. Okay, you need to assume as true. But then the reality is that these propositions can either be true or false, or some propositions are surely false, right? Okay. So my question, as you can imagine, is regards the question of the soul. And I say it's problematic to formulate because it depends already on what you mean by soul, because Kant is very, very, very unclear about that. Sometimes it seems just a concept of like a polemical object generated from rational psychology. Sometimes it seems something that he himself uses it, considers in a positive way. Sometimes it's just the in itself of the self. But my point, my question is that, don't you think that maybe it's possible that the idea of the soul, considered in different ways, can be both, can generate both propositions that are about which we cannot say that they are true or false, and propositions that that we know that are false. For example, if you say that we have to assume that the soul exists as a substance, you could either say the soul as a non-sensible ground of my spontaneity or whatever is a substance, then we don't know, and a non-schematized substance, then we don't know if it's true or false. But then if we say the soul as the empirical ground of my inner appearances is a substance, we know that is false, at least according to many interpreters that say that we cannot apply the concept of the category of substance to inner sense, because some think we can, but let's assume that you cannot do it just straightforwardly. Then we know that this is false. And of course, one way to solve this could be, for example, to exclude, like to say that these two aspects of the concept of the notion of soul cannot be both right for Kant, let's put it this way. So you can bring one to the other. For example, you can say that the soul that Kant has in mind as a polemical target is assumed by the rationalist, the rational psychologist, as an object of inner sense, for example, no? So this is not Kant's view, but this is the polemical target, the soul considered as an object of, as given in inner sense. And in this case, only one of these two cases would obtain. For in this case, the one that is necessarily false, because if it's given as an object of inner sense, we cannot say that it is a substance in a way. So, so this could be a way to solve it. But I actually more I prefer to keep the complexity of the notion of the soul, because the complexity is already in the text. I cannot see an easy solution to that. But I wanted to know what you think about it in general. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. That's really interesting. And so I mean, one way to develop what you're saying is to say, well, maybe this distinction is not really between a kind of or some of the cosmological ideas and the other ideas, but this is a distinction that you can find, I mean, not only within the cosmological ideas, maybe even within the psychological ideas, and so that would make the things even more complex. But so this is just a thought. I don't know if it works, but so maybe one way to say, in the case of the psychological ideas, we have grounds to making the decision, let's say, to keep one, to take one side or the other. And in particular, I would go for the side that says, so ideas describes or imply proposition that can be true or false, is to say, well, the idea that are here at stake are ideas that so maintain some plausibility after our critical scrutiny, right? So and if that's the case, we might say that the idea of a substantial empirical soul can be put aside after the critical scrutiny, even though, of course, I know that there are some interpreters that want to maintain that, but I'm here just considering a possible way to go. So that, I mean, so we have grounds then to say that there is no, I mean, so the point is that my question regarding the status of ideas concern ideas that can have a possible legitimate use. And it seems regulative or practical or whatever. And it's when the soul is concerned, maybe there are grounds to say that the ideas this possible legitimate regulative use is the idea of noumenal soul, and in that case, proposition regarding that that object are possibly true or false. Does that make sense? Microphone?
You should switch on your
Okay.
microphone.
Yeah, you know, I was in another tab, so I had to go back to Zoom, and now, so sorry. Yeah, it makes sense. Like what you are saying is that even though we can use the idea of soul, let's say that even if we have the idea of soul as useful for empirical psychology, we are still using the idea of noumenal soul. And in this case, we are still using, yeah, okay. So we are talking about the noumenal soul, either if we talk about like what is the ground of spontaneity, is it like matter and the soul in itself different or not? Can we say something about it? And either if we use this concept as a guide for psychology, I would agree with the view, which is actually the simple view. I would say I would say that in general there are many passages that make that more complex, because Kant seems sometimes, even though you do not expect that, sometimes he really seems to talk about the soul as object of inner sense. Even when you don't want to read that, you say, no, I thought I understood everything, and he's still talking about that, and he's not just criticizing his opponent, and then you go crazy. So that's why I try to expand. But in general, that would be the simple way, and it would perfectly fit with also your proposal. So maybe is the best one. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, thank you. So Laura, and then I have also a couple of questions. So please, Laura Marond.
So thank you very much for the talk. Is it? Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Great. So I have a small clarification question regarding the last part of your talk. So I'm not a Kantian, so sorry in advance if it sounds too naive. So the question regards the slide. The heading was 2 types of ideas of reason, and it's shortly before you started speaking about the first antinomy. And so you say that, if I understood you correctly, so that proposition involved by cosmological ideas are false, while proposition involved by theological and psychological ideas can be true. So I think I followed you, and as far as the second part of this sentence is concerned, I think I got what you wanted to say and to explain, but it's less clear to me the first part. So why are propositions concerning cosmological ideas false, and are they always false? So I guess the answer lies in the antinomies that you were explaining after that, but I got a bit lost, so maybe you can explain briefly in a few words, say why they are false and if it does occur always or not. Thanks.
Yeah, so thanks for the question, and I should apologize for, going really fast on very difficult issues in Kant, but yeah, I didn't want to go into the details, just to give you the main idea. But so so why do I say that all cosmological ideas imply false proposition? Well, my idea is this. So when when we develop all version of the cosmological ideas, so regarding, the completeness of the existence of the world in time and space, regarding the parts of substances, and regarding causality, regarding the I mean, the necessary condition of condition things existing and so on. We always think these. So the central to our thinking about all this issue is the idea of a totality, right? This is characteristic as a totality of condition. This is characteristic of all the cosmological ideas. And also I think we think this totality always as totality of appearances, right? And you might then say, well, I can follow you when you say that all proposition in the cosmological ideas are false, as far the ideas behind the mathematical antinomies are concerned, because in that case, Kant clearly says that both thesis and antithesis are false. Yeah, I mean, if those are propositions that are somehow related to the cosmological idea behind it, then it makes sense maybe to say in this case they are false. But it is not so clear in the case of the dynamical antinomies, because in that case it says that both can be true. So it seems that we can have cosmological ideas linked to possibly true proposition. But I think here is important to distinguish between the setting of the antinomies, so in the dynamical antinomies, and the solution. And in the way the antinomy is construed, both thesis and antithesis are thought as totality of appearances, let's say, or as totality in which each member of the totality would be an object with the same properties of the other members. And Kant, I think, thinks that cannot be a totality of appearances in this sense, even for the cosmological ideas related to the dynamical antinomies. So in this sense, proposition involved by all cosmological ideas are false. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much.
Are there other questions or remarks? Okay, so I take advantage of my chairing position. I have actually a couple of questions. Well, the first one is apparently simple, let's say. So what Kant really says with regard to the mathematical antinomy that is of relevance, I think, for not only for your discourse, but also for the project, for the ERC project we are in, is the following. The series, when we look at the way in which reason builds up the series, and therefore the syllogists that give rise to the antinomy, to the dilemmas. So the world is finite or the world is infinite, for example. Apart from, of course, taking the world as a nomenon, in a sense, or as the totality of all there is, that's the problem. Kant also says it's we apply a mathematical concept of infinity to the series, rather the simple truth, let's say, is that we must apply a philosophical concept of infinity, and in this case is the concept of a series in indefinitum that constitutes the solution to the mathematical antinomies in such a way that even if it's true that the propositions, the world is finite with respect to space and time, and the world is infinite with respect to space and time, are false, Yet, the cosmological principle that Kant Kant highlights this principle, this cosmological principle, as the solution to the mathematical antinomies, is that the world is indefinite with regard to space and time, so to its extension, both space and time. Now, to be indefinite, let's say, or better, to consider the world as being indefinite with respect to its boundaries, doesn't mean that it is indeterminate. These are two different concepts. I always insist in this this distinction, because of course, if something is indefinite, doesn't mean that it's not indeterminable per se. So what's your first reaction to this comment? So don't you think that you should, in a sense, highlight the fact that even if the propositions of the mathematical antinomy are both considered and to be considered as false, yet there is room for a true cosmological principle with a regulative function in Kant's work?
Yeah, thanks for this. So I agree that it is important to take into consideration the view that the series in the case of the mathematical antinomies, I mean, the right way to see and consider the series of conditions is to claim that this is indefinite. I think the only difference, in my view, is that if we should characterize what is the content of the cosmological idea behind the conflict, I would say that that content exclude, in a certain sense, that the series is indefinite, in the sense that so the ideas the idea assumes that there is a determinate yeah, and now I don't remember the exact wording Kant uses, but yeah, I mean that there is a determinate quantity that is given, and if when we assume this, so Kant says in the solution, when you assume this, then it is true that this quantity should be either finite or infinite, and then you have the problem. And the solution then is to say, well, there's not this determinate quantity, and so you open up the possibility for a third option, which is claiming that the series can be indefinite because you do not have a determinate quantity. So that's so now, then I think it's important to look at the passages, but I would say that the only difference in my view is that I would not consider the so the claim that says the series is indefinite as still content of the cosmological idea that is behind also the conflict itself. So it's I think something new is introduced there.
Oh, no, I agree with you. I mean, of course, indeed he calls it resolution. So, and it does not even tell us anything about, let's say, any positive content of cosmology, be it theoretical or observational. And now comes my second question that is connected to this one, because if we look at the metaphysical foundations of natural science, and I don't even mention the opus posthumum because, of course, it's more problematic. But if you think of the metaphysical foundations of natural science, and if we think of the phenomenology, we have a clear grasp, I think, of what Kant means in the first critique, in the second edition, but also in the first edition in this case, with regard to, the scope of the dialectic, the transcendental dialectic, in particular of the antinomy, because we are in a context in which we're dealing with the metaphysics of nature. This is clearly stated, and we are dealing with a certain view, not just of an abstract system, but of the system of experience and the universe as well, and in a very explicit way in the last part of the metaphysical foundations of natural science. And therefore we have this, I find it very interesting and stimulating reading, because we find this application of the idea of absolute space. And we cannot say that absolute space is something pertaining to the phenomena per se, of course. So there is the use, so Kant makes it explicit. So it's a regulative use of absolute space. And the interesting thing is that in that context, he breaks the symmetry with time, and he says, okay, we must postulate absolute space, but not absolute time, because otherwise we have infinite acceleration and we cannot measure, we cannot compare reference frames. So I think that, in a sense, your discourse can be strengthened by an example like that, or pick up another one, but from Kant's metaphysics, so from Kant's positive, formulation of his system in metaphysical terms, because you have here an example of the fact that the whole of experience is indeterminate with respect to time, is indefinite with respect to time. You don't have absolute time. But on the other hand, is indefinite even with respect to space, because you're using the idea of absolute space in a regulative way. And of course, if you take the universe as a whole, but not as a complete one, as indefinite in its synthesis, what you have is the use of a concept that is what we call today in philosophy of science a sort of a fiction, but in a positive sense, that helps you in doing what? In justifying the possibility of measuring and comparing different reference frames. So this is, I think, something that maybe I don't know whether you want to comment on it, but I think that can be useful in order to see whether and how Kant's critique works in effective way, in an effective manner.
Yeah, thanks. That's useful. So I don't know well these passages, but I mean, these could be, if I understand you well, so passages in which you have an application of an idea and a regulative idea, and Kant says there is a legitimate use of that idea, where it is also clear that the idea, is related to propositions that are false for Kant, and then can be related to one type of ideas that I consider, right? So if we
no, basically it's an idea without which we couldn't literally we couldn't measure different reference frames that are in relative motion to each other
Yeah, but
because you need a scalar. Put it in a very
yeah.
And Kant says, I don't pick up time because otherwise I would have infinite acceleration. It would be a mess. Let's say this universe would be. I could not measure anything. And in this sense, you can see that his distance from Newton is closer to Euler. And then he says, well, but I must use the idea of absolute space in order to measure, in order to make sense of these different references.
You know, but so my
I can connect, I can unify. So the function attributed to the use of this idea is not to is not other, but it's not another one, but just the fact of ensuring unity.
Yeah, of course, I get that, but my question is how we should characterize then this idea of absolute space that we use regulatively.
It's not a proposition. So in your discourse, I see sorry if I say that, but sometimes it appears to me that when we talk about the truth of a certain proposition, we are not actually strictly speaking talking about the idea of reason. And I explained to you in which sense I'm saying that, because it's a singular concept. In Kant's logic, an idea is a singular concept. So a concept cannot be neither true or false. A proposition can be true or false. So we cannot attribute truth or falsity to an idea in itself. We can make a legitimate or an illegitimate use of that idea in a certain context. In this case, of course, Kant says, no, it's just regulative. We don't know anything about absolute space per se, but we use this concept in order to measure.
Yeah, of course. I mean, at the beginning of the talk, I was, trying to prevent this objection, but the idea is that, when you use an idea as a correct description of the word, then you can derive some proposition from it and say that they are true. If it is a valid use of it, and so if the idea of absolute space is at stake here, you would so the question is, so proposition describing space are, if we have the idea of absolute space, and this is an idea, we would have a proposition related to that idea that is of the form space is such and such, space is such and such, and then we can of course ask whether so those propositions are true, false, or possibly true or false, right? That's the idea.
This is in general is true, but if we consider Kant's metaphysics of nature, so if you consider what he says in the metaphysical foundations of natural science, in the phenomenology, he says that the phenomenology is what enables us to make experience. And so the concept of the idea of absolute space, it's not that okay, let's assume this terminology is true, okay, in its regulative use, blah blah blah. Well, I don't have to apply it to the idea of the whole world as an homogenon, blah blah blah. But it's true because I can measure, because I can make experience. It's an extremely radical step that Kant takes makes in the phenomenology, because he says he reverses in a sense he reverses the discourse of the critique. So he says, now I show you not just the condition of possibility for any experience. No, it says that I show you how I transform appearance into experience, and how in doing that I use ideas of reason, and in using them I effectively can make experience. And the fact that I can effectively measure different reference frames, then it's the proof that it's correct and it's true, let's say. So it's I don't know whether
yeah,
I'm explaining myself. It's a very different approach, let's say.
No, it's interesting, but yeah, I think, I mean, I should look it up, and I mean, the fact that if it refers to the idea of absolute space, and he uses so Newton account of it, then so it would be interesting to see how it is legitimate to use it, but I mean I should think about it and look at the passages just to locate then these idea. And
but
this
I
is
think
the one
that indeed it would be even nice, because it could give you a sort of a case study or something like that in order to test your paper. I mean the thesis discussed today, so it would be nice.
Yeah. Thanks. I take that as a suggestion.
Well, I thank you very much, Gabriele. It was very interesting. We had a lot of questions. It's not 5, so thank you very much for having been here today, and thank you all, and see you all to the next seminar, which is in about a couple of weeks. Thank you very much.
Thank you again for the question. It has been great.